I'd rather not. That's the title, that's the topic of today's daily dose. Have you all ever heard this kind of way of thinking? Kind of goes like this. If Christians are going to reach this world, then we need to fit in. You ever heard that? Or how about this one? The church needs to be more relevant. And of course, what do we do then? We wrongly define relevance as fitting in with the world, looking and sounding like the world. People will tell us things like, you know what, people won't listen to us Christians unless they think that we're one of them. Well, I look at all of this and I think, has this approach of fitting in been actually working? I think it's a big NO. No, it hasn't. In fact, I would argue that much of the so-called church actually looks more like the world now than the world looking more like the church. So Daniel, talked about him a little bit last week. Daniel, from the lion's den, that Daniel, he had a completely different approach. In fact, when we look at his life, we discover a man that had a massive amount of influence over an entire nation, not a godly nation. He even had influence over kings. They sought him out and listened to him. Yet Daniel never tried to fit in. Daniel, he took a different approach. He said, I'd rather not. And I believe this approach should be our approach today. We need to look at the world, the brokenness, the hopelessness, the lack of answers, and say, I'd rather not. You see, Daniel rejected conformity. Check out Daniel's response with this pressure to go along with a godless culture. In Daniel 1:8, it says this, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Daniel resolved. Did you see that? Daniel resolved. In other words, Daniel decided, he determined, beyond any doubt, beyond any ambiguity, it was settled. He knew what he was going to do. He knew what he would and would not do. He knew who he would and who he would not be. Look, if we don't resolve, if we don't determine ahead of time how we're going to respond and act, then more than likely we're going to just conform to our surroundings. We have to draw lines that we will not cross. We have to identify those mountains that we're not going to give up. So even right now, think about this. What are some of the lines you've drawn? The lines that you won't cross? Have you drawn lines? I hope so. Maybe even right now, you can even pause this video right now and just write down what are some of those lines that you've resolved to not cross. Remind yourself of those things. Here are some lines that we definitely shouldn't cross. They're found in Psalm 1, where it says, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. In other words, people who are not allowing the influence and the thinking of this world to influence them, who are being careful what they listen to, right? So, and it goes back to Scripture. And also, blessed are the people who do not stand in the way of sinners. In other words, we don't hang out with that crowd or sit in the seat of mockers, people who mock God, people who mock biblical truth and righteousness, who mock creation, who mock marriage, who mock human sexuality, man and a woman, the way God created it. But his delight, the man who is blessed, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by the streams of water, which yield its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Psalm 1:1-3. See, Daniel resolved. He didn't live a wishy-washy life. He rejected the gray area. Look, when I read this passage from Psalm 1, my mind goes to our education system. Most of our universities and frankly high schools, and it's getting into grade schools, they're filled with humanistic thought. Professors and teachers who mock God. Who mock God. The result is what? A young generation that's being robbed of truth, robbed of hope, robbed of joy, robbed of God's best for them. The Apostle Paul, check out what he has to say. He calls the church to live with the same kind of resolve that Daniel did, really, when he says, do not conform. He's speaking to believers. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Don't go along, right? But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you're going to be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Romans 12:2. Notice, conforming keeps us from transforming. Conforming to the ways of this world keeps us from transforming into who God has saved us and redeemed us to be. See, as Christ followers, we got to reject the go along to get along mentality. We got to be more like Daniel. We got to resolve to not go along with this world. We got to reject any kind of compromise. Our answer should be, I'd rather not.